Okay, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much as always. I've just, if you didn't see, I've just muted everyone, but please obviously feel free to use the unmute or chat if you want to ask anything or make comments. So I think we need to, there's still a little bit of work we need to put into this topic. One issue is the extent of rabbinic authority in terms of who is granted it. So we looked at the pasuk of Luzzatto, the pasuk in Zobin chapter Gedolim, which creates an issa, a lav, Luzzatto min hadavar sheyagidu lecha, and also creates a mitzvah saseh al pi vasis al pi hadavar sheyagidu lecha. So there's both a positive mitzvah and a prohibition to listen or not to listen to the words of rabbinic authority. But then we had lots of questions about the extent of rabbinic authority. Does this extent include anyone, even rabbinic authority nowadays? Sorry, there's been a problem with the link. Okay, someone seems to have corrected it, so let me just see if I can correct it. 1 second. Apparently the link I posted in the group was wrong. Just give me 1 second, people are having trouble. Okay, apologies for the delay, sorted out the technical issues. Okay, so we need to discuss the extent of rabbinic authority, both in terms of does it only apply to the Sanhedrin or does it apply nowadays also? And secondly, what is the extent of this authority? Is it only to strict divrei Torah, or is it even to material matters of this world, politics, health advice? Should one be seeking das Torah around these issues? So we looked at two sources so far, the Chinuch and the Rambam. Interestingly, the Chinuch extended the parameter of, both of them, I should say, adopted the stance that the basis of rabbinic authority is in order to allow a functioning legal system to work, a sort of utilitarian system. You need a final decisor, otherwise the legal system falls apart. The Rambam, however, added also a more mystical element here there and spoke about a form of divine assistance. But the Chinuch also extended this in time and lent this authority to rabbinic authority in every generation. And the rationale behind this is reasonable. If the reason why one needs rabbinic authority is to avoid fragmentation of a legal system, you need someone to decide what halacha means, what the law means, then this should apply, this should be necessary even nowadays. Let's have a look at the Rambam, who has a very interesting theory in this whole area, and one which the Rambam drew practical conclusions from in a number of interesting ways. So we're going to go back and we're going to look at the Rambam in Hilchos Mamrim. This is the Rambam that we should be familiar with by now, because this is the same Rambam that we looked at when we were learning Torah Sheba'al Peh and Rabbinic in action. So this will be the third time we're looking at the Rambam. The Rambam, in the beginning of Hilchos Mamrim, speaks about rabbinic authority. That's his topic. He talks about the rebellious sage, the Zobin Mamre, who refuses to accept the ruling of the Beis Din HaGadol of the Supreme Court. And in that Rambam, he discusses the parameters of rabbinic authority. The Rambam we saw extends rabbinic authority beyond the Ramban. He says it's not just authority for interpretation, it's also authority for innovation, for creating new drabbanons. And the Ramban Nachmanides disagreed with that, as we saw previously. But who does the Rambam grant this authority to? Which body has authority? Who are Chazal? When we talk about the ability of Chazal with their authority to interpret and their authority to create drabbanons, who does it refer to? So let's look at what the Rambam says, because the Rambam actually in his Mishnah Torah gives a relatively narrow range to whom this authority is granted. And I want to share my screen here to allow me to do so just for a few moments. And this is the familiar Rambam that we've seen already. And look what the Rambam says. Beis Din HaGadol Sheb Yerushalayim, it is the Supreme Court in Yerushalayim. Heim Ikar Torah Sheba'al Peh. They are the essence of Torah Sheba'al Peh. They're Mamutei Hara, and they are the pillars of instruction. Omehem Chok u'Mishpat Yotze l'Chol Yisrael, and from them comes out Chok u'Mishpat. V'aleim Ivticha Torah, and it is about them that the Torah promises Al Pi HaTorah She'Yerucha. So the Rambam quotes our pasuk, And the pasuk that we saw in Devarim that says one needs to listen to rabbinic authority, positive mitzvah saseh, and in halacha beis, kol mi she'eino osa k'rasa, anyone who doesn't listen to them over below saseh transgresses a negative prohibition of lo sasor. But who does this apply to? Says the Rambam very clearly, the Beis Din Hagadol Sheb'Yerushalayim, the great court in Jerusalem. Now, where does the Rambam get from that this authority is only granted to the great court in Jerusalem? The answer is, well, this is the pasuk that we saw so long ago. This is the pasuk in Lo Sasor, in Devarim, which we analyzed, because there the pasuk says, when it grants authority, that this is the Kamtov Elisa and Amakim Ashiv Hashem. One should ascend to the place which Hashem has chosen. In other words, the Beis Hamikdash. Who is it who sits in the Beis Hamikdash and from there issues halachic ruling? Only the Beis Din Hagadol, only the Supreme Court, and therefore the Rambam is of the view that this mitzvah only applies to the Beis Din Hagadol and not to any later authority. However, like so much else in the Rambam, this isn't quite so simple. And the Rambam, in the continuation to Hilchos Mamrim, and indeed in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, and by the way, anyone who hasn't done this should take time that they have available to read through the Rambam's introduction, both to Mishnah Torah and Sefer Mitzvahs. Both of them are available in, obviously in Lashon HaKodesh in Hebrew, in the original, and they're available online in, I think, Chabad and other sources in English. Definitely worth a read, a fascinating picture, sweeping picture that the Rambam has of so many areas in Judaism. But there in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, the Rambam again writes the same idea. And in both cases, he talks about a gathering of all, or perhaps a very significant percentage of the Jewish people, of the rabbinic leadership, and says that when they engage in mass communication, then they have authority also. And the Rambam is writing this in a fascinating piece, and let me just try and maybe explain this a little bit. The Rambam is a theory which comes up in numerous sources, that the role of the Sanhedrin, the Beis Din HaGadol in Yerushalayim, is that somehow they encapsulate and represent the whole of the Jewish people. So they're not just the Beis Din, the legislative body, whose job it is to interpret the Torah, but they are also, in a sense, a part of the executive of the Jewish people representing communal issues. So, for example, and this is really a Gemara, the role of the Sanhedrin is not just in determining strict halacha, but it's also in signing off, for example, on an executive's decision, the king's decision to go to war, and various other communal functions. You need the great court, the Sanhedrin HaGadol, to try the king or the Kohen Gadol, because this is a matter of, in a sense, national importance. When you try a king, they're not a normal citizen, but they are the king, the Kohen Gadol, and therefore they can only be tried by the Sanhedrin. And this is something the Rambam speaks about on a number of occasions. They're representatives of the whole people. The Rambam extends this therefore and says that when you have a gathering of all the Chachamim Yisrael, and when you have Haskamas Klal Yisrael, the agreement of the whole of Klal Yisrael, this is equivalent to the Sanhedrin. So this is relevant in many scenarios. This is relevant in the famous issue of the attempts to restore the Smicha. So we know that Smicha was something which was handed down from generation to generation, ish mipi ish, from Moshe Rabbeinu. The original rabbinic ordination could only be handed down with an unbroken chain of Masorah. This was lost in the era of the Amoraim, and Smicha, due to Roman persecution, Rome, of course, ruled Eretz Israel, was unable to continue, and the chain of transmission of Smicha was lost. Henceforth, what we call Smicha is simply rabbinic permission to paskin, but not true Smicha, and this was reflected by the adoption of the name Rav instead of Rebbe. So those who are labeled Rebbe, primarily the Tanoim and some of the Amoraim from Eretz Israel, got true Smicha. Those who are labeled Rav only got the later innovative sort of non-Smicha Smicha of permission to paskin, which is what we call Smicha to this day. Now the Rambam has a view that Smicha can be restored by agreement of the whole Chachmei ha'ummah. As long as the whole Jewish people, all the scholars of the Jewish people agree to this, smicha can be restored. And in fact, an attempt has been made to do such a thing over various times through the generations. In 1538, Rabbi Yaakov Beirav in Safat attempted to restore smicha, and he did this by gathering together those who considered the leaders of the Jewish people, and he himself was the first to receive smicha. He then gave smicha onwards to 4 figures, including no less than Rabbi Yosef Karo, the author of the Shulchan Aruch, amongst them. Rabbi Yosef Karo took this halachic psak seriously, and he gave smicha to a number of figures, including the Alshich, Moshe Alshich. Moshe Alshich gave smicha to Reb Chaim Vital. So this was something that carried on for several generations and was taken very seriously by the Rabbanim at the time. So the psak of the Rambam, that Sanhedrin type conditions can be recreated even as technically as restoration of smicha, is one that was attempted by the Gedolei Olam, by really the leaders of the generation, including Rabbi Beirav and Reb Chaim Vital and Alshich and Yosef Karo and other great figures. It was opposed at the time primarily by someone called Reb Levi ibn Chaviv, who was a Rav in Yerushalayim, and various others. I don't want to go through the whole history now, but this attempt was restored, was tried other times, including by the first generation Talmidim of the Vilna Gaon. A very, very important halachic concept, according to the Rambam, that Sanhedrin-like authority can be recreated by haskamas ha'ummah, by agreement of the people. Now, the Rambam views this as applicable to the era up to Chasimas HaTalmud, the conclusion of the Talmud. This is really a topic in its own right, but very briefly, what is the source of authority for Chazal, for the Mishnah and Gemara? And why is it that later authorities, Gedolim and Rishonim, don't argue on them? So one possible answer is Yerida Sadoris, a decline in the knowledge of the scholars of the generation. This is a possible good answer to the question, and we no longer have the Torah knowledge to argue with them. However, the Rambam in several places, including obviously in his Moed Nevuchim, in his Guide to the Perplexed, and alluding to this idea in his halachic work, in his introduction to Mishnah Torah, doesn't buy into this. He's not convinced that there is always a decline in Torah knowledge, and there may be decline in some generations and other generations, Achshir Torah. There isn't a clear ironclad principle that this concept of Yerida Sadoris exists. We've spoken about this, by the way, in the concept of Achshir Torah, when we spoke about both in the philosophers, as represented by the Rambam, and the Kabbalists, believe there are spiritual insights we can achieve nowadays that perhaps weren't accessible to previous generations. This could be in the area of Kabbalah and the increased revelation of Kabbalah, according to the Kabbalists. This could be in ethical and philosophical and even scientific insights, according to the Rambam and the rationalists. However, in principle, this idea of Yerida Sadoris, that there's an inevitable decline in Torah knowledge, is not something that the Rambam takes on board as ironclad whatsoever. So what is it that gives the authority to till the time of the Chasimas HaTalmud? And the answer, says the Rambam, is because till that time there was proper communication amongst all the scholars of the generation, and therefore acceptance by the whole people of their authority. And this is reflecting unique geographical and historical circumstances. So until the time of the conclusion of the Talmud, the Makom HaTorah, the location of all serious Talmidei Chachamim, is in one geographic region, Bavel. And all yeshivas and Rosh yeshivas and Talmidei Chachamim are in communication with each other. There's a process of communication. There's a handful of great yeshivas, Surah, Pompadisa, and so on, where all basically the Chachmei Hadar are located, and they discuss everything amongst them. They convene together at certain times, and there's an open conversation in which everyone can take part. In fact, when we learn Gemara, we see this explicitly. You see how one Amora will voice an opinion, another Amora, who's geographically in a different yeshiva, will question and argue, and later generations will engage in virtual conversation, as it were, with the earlier generations. There's a constant conversation going on, and therefore Gemara represents the conclusion of all the Chachmei HaTalmud, all the Chachmei HaTorah, alive at the time. It's a complete unified conversation, and therefore we can be sure this represents a consensus view that emerges from the Torah representatives of the time, and therefore you have something somewhat equivalent to the Sanhedrin, because you have Haskomas Kol HaUmmah. And the Rambam carries on that simply, the Rambam, carries on that simply since the Chasimus Talmud, we've never had those conditions, and therefore we don't have the equivalent authority lent to later figures. The Rambam sees this in functional terms, that halacha grants authority, and there's rational, logical reasons for this. When everyone is able to engage in debate, it makes sense that they have the authority and they have haskamas ummah. Since then, we haven't had those conditions. What have we had? Post the era of the Talmud, Torah spread, and you had a lot of Torah still, of course, in Bavel, but you also had Torah in Spain and in France and in North Germany and in other locations, and therefore you had different clusters of rabbinic authority, and they weren't able in the same manner to engage in proper and complete communication, and therefore you never had haskamas ummah. People didn't accept the authority of any one rabbinic grouping like we accepted the authority of the Gemara, but rather you had Jews who lived in North France and Germany and Ashkenaz accepting the Rishonim there, and Jews that lived in Spain accepting the authority of the Rishonim there, and that's how you ended up with diverse rabbinic authority, and therefore none of them have the same authority as the Sanhedrin, as Chasimas HaTalmud. None of them therefore represent the last word on a topic. So this is the view of the Rambam, and this is elaborated on both by the Rambam himself and by later commentaries. So for example, Rabbi Chanan Wassman, who we've met previously, who, number one, interestingly, we met most recently when he argued for a very broad and powerful definition of Das Torah. We met him before that when he explained the Rambam's view of rabbinic authority with mitzvahs Rabbanon, also engages in an essay around the Rambam's view about Haskamas Ummah, and he argues that this is the view of the Rambam, and I think it's very clear in the Rambam that when you have unified authority, this is equivalent, at least somewhat, to the authority of the Sanhedrin. In brief, I'm arguing that even though the Rambam says that this love of Luzzatto only applies to the Beis HaGadol Yerushalayim, to me it is clear that the Rambam would agree that if you had Haskamas Ummah, you had agreement of the whole people, you had a collection of all the Chachmei Hador, all the Talmidei Chachamim of the generation who reached agreement on a subject, or at least majority agreement, they were all able to engage in conversation. The Rambam would argue they also had authority. Whether this would be the technical authority of Luzzatto or not is subject to debate, but clearly the Rambam is of the view that they would have halachic authority, and their view would be taken as determinant of psak, and therefore one that needs to be followed. Now, interestingly, and this is an important point, there is that this expressed itself in how the Rambam functioned in his life. And again, one always has to be careful when one speaks about historical influences on great people and the role of other factors in Pesach. However, the Rambam was a very innovative thinker, as we know. And the Rambam was engaged in attempting to revolutionize the Jewish world in numerous areas. In halacha, he systemized halacha like no one had before him since the time of the Mishnah by writing his Mishnah Torah. And he was of the view that he was the greatest halachic authority of his generation. And therefore, he was of the view that the Mishnah Torah was absolutely convincing. And also, he wanted to revolutionize philosophical thinking of Torah with his own way of thinking about things as per the Moreh Nevuchim. Now, the Rambam came under a lot of opposition. He came under halachic opposition. We're aware, for example, of the glosses of the Ravid on the Rambam's Mishnah Torah, in which the Ravid from Provence disagrees with the Rambam. There was a lot of halachic attack against the Rambam, most of it not vicious. It was classic halachic debate. And then there was a lot of attack against the Rambam philosophically, much of which was very, very pointed and very strong and very harsh, unlike normal halachic debates that take place in the Jewish world. Now, the Rambam, amongst other things, felt he was able to argue with the view of the Gedolim. And when I say Gedolim, I don't just mean the Gedolim in the era pre the Rishonim, but I also mean the rabbinic authorities in Bovel at the time. And let me explain this point, because this is really important. After the sealing of the Talmud, Bovel continued to be a major Torah center. Not just a major, but the major Torah center. It is true that Torah was now spread more widely, and that political and historical circumstances, in particular the rising influence of the Muslim conquest of that region, meant that there was no longer the conditions that the Rambam had described for the conclusion of the Talmud. There was no longer open debate amongst a limited number of yeshivas, and Torah was more spread widely, and there wasn't the possibility of open debate. Nonetheless, the major Torah center was in Bovel, no doubt about that. After the close of the era of the Gedolim, so we're talking roughly, let's say, just argument's sake, the year 950 to 1000, one now had a number of Torah centers, many of which equaled or even surpassed the Torah center in Bovel. And this is the dawn of the era that we know as the era of the Rishonim. So from the year 950, which is approximately the year of the death of what we call the last Gaon, Rav Hai Gaon, suddenly Torah flourishes in Italy, in North Africa, in Spain, in France, and you have an enormous number of Torah centers there, with all the famous names that we know. In North Africa, you have the Rif and Rabbi Hananel. In Spain, you have Anani Migash, and eventually you have the Rambam. And Italy, you have Rishonim, and of course in Ashkenaz, you have Rabbi Gershon and the Chachamim, followed a couple of generations later by Rashi, and you have a massive flourishing of Torah. Now, the historical circumstances that led to this divide are not entirely clear. I want to give an analogy which I've used before, but if we look at the year 1900, the primary Torah center, let's say, is East Europe, with a little bit of Torah centers elsewhere in North Africa and in the Middle East, but certainly in terms of number and output, the primary Torah center is East Europe. Year 2000, we probably have two primary Torah centers in the world, America and Israel. Imagine if historically, we didn't know anything about this 100 years. And historically, we simply knew a fact. 1900 East Europe, 2000 Israel and America. And we didn't know what explained that massive shifting. Something like that is analogous to the difference between, let's say, the year 900 and the year 1000. There was no big historic event. We don't think we're missing anything like that. There wasn't something like a Holocaust which led to this sudden shift. But what is a fact is that in terms of Torah, between the year 900 with Bovel as the Torah center, and the year 1000 with North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany as Torah centers, Spain, of course, something has happened. Some massive shift happened, and we don't know exactly what caused it. We don't think it's the equivalent of one big cataclysmic event, like the shift from East Europe to Israel and America. But somehow, in a very short space of time, there was an accumulation of economic and Torah factors, which led to a tipping point and an extreme change. The fact is, in the year 900, majority of Torah in Bovel, year 1000, very, very prominent Torah centers in all these locations, rivaling and even surpassing the Torah centers of Bovel. So what is the authority of the era of the Gedolim between the conclusion of the Talmud, we'll call that the year 600, and the year 1000, those 400 years or so? Question number one. Question number two, does Bovel have any lingering Torah authority post the year 950? Is it senior, first amongst equals, of all these Torah centers that exist? Now, the first question is somewhat controversial, and many Rishonim and late authorities seem to grant the Gedolim greater halachic authority to a degree than the Rishonim, somewhat a little bit analogous to the position of the Gemara itself, in which case we would divide Jewish history into eras in which Mishnah is sealed, the Gemara won't argue on Mishnah, Gemara is sealed, post-Gemara won't argue on Gemara, and Gedolim, the era of the Gedolim conclude, and to some degree, the Rishonim won't argue on the Gedolim. The Rambam doesn't accept this. The Rambam believes he can argue on the Gedolim, and his source for this is, because as we said, he believes the authority of earlier generations are not just Yeridas HaTorah, a decline in Torah knowledge, which may or may not happen to take place, but more significantly, the agreement cross scholarship, cross the Jewish world to accept the authority. And the Rambam says there was no such agreement. Already in the era of the Gedolim, there were smaller, but still significant Torah centers elsewhere, and therefore this authority doesn't apply. This is the Rambam's first point. The second point of the Rambam is, he is certainly not interested in accepting the authority of the current leadership in Bovel, of the leadership that are contemporary to him in Bovel. And he argues, yes, you have yeshivas in Bovel, you have Rosh yeshivas in Bovel, but they are not heirs, they are not the intellectual descendants, they are not the inheritors of the authorities of the Gedolim. And what often isn't realized is that the Rosh yeshiva in Bovel continue to style themselves Gedolim even after the close of the Geonic era. And some of them argue and believe they have authority of the Gedolim. They are the Rosh Yeshivas, not of any old Torah center, but of the Torah center in Bovel, which for, by that point in the year 1200, in the time of the Rambam, has been the preeminent Torah center for more than 1,000 years, or for 1,000 years. So they are sure that they have the Geonic authority. And they criticize the Rambam's innovations, philosophically like everyone else does, halachically like many others also do, but with an attack and a vehemence of attack against the Rambam's halachic work, which is unusual. When it came to the Rambam's halachic work, he was viewed as a Rishon by his peers, and they generally disagreed in a respectful manner. But the Geonim, or the pseudo-Geonim, the Rosh Yeshivas in Bovel, attacked the Rambam heavily and significantly. Don't forget the Rambam is located in Egypt, he's not that far from Bovel. The Rishonim like Rashi and the Bali Tosfos in North France don't really have much contact with Bovel. They don't, it doesn't have influence what the Babylonian Rosh Yeshivas are saying. They perhaps don't even know what they're doing. But the Rambam is close to Bovel. He's being attacked by the Geonim or the Rosh Yeshivas in Bovel. So this is what else is going on at the time. And therefore, when the Rambam is saying that the Geonim don't have authority, he's giving space for himself to argue with the historic Geonim for the 400 years before him, and he's also giving space to himself to argue with the current Rosh Yeshiva in Bovel. And he's arguing that now and henceforth, where we don't have communal cohesion, cross-national communal cohesion, where all of Klal Yisrael are accepting one authority, rabbinic authority is only achieved on its own merit. It's only achieved by the degree to which they can convince others of their authority. And interestingly, the Rambam is convinced that the Mishnah Torah will be the last word, but not because it has Sanhedrin type authority, but simply because it's such a good work, such a phenomenal work. Therefore, it will achieve dominance, but there isn't dominance granted just by dint of authority as Geonim or Sanhedrin. So this is the view of the Rambam. And for those who are interested in the history, you may know the figure of Reb Shmuel ben Eli, who was the Rosh Yeshiva in Bovel at the time, and he claims that he was still a Gaon, that he still had the authority of the Geonim, that he could tax all Jews who had to pay towards financing his yeshiva in Bovel, like was the case in the era of the Geonim, when all the scattered communities across the Jewish world contributed to the Rosh Yeshiva in Bovel. And he also, in the context of our discussion around Das Torah, claimed that he had secular authority, that it was up to him as the Rosh Yeshiva to appoint the lay leadership of Bovel. The lay leadership in Bovel was known as the Reish Galosa, in English translated as the Exilarch, the lay political authority of the whole of the Jewish world. By the time of the Rambam, again, the Exilarch's authority was not relevant to the scattered Jewish communities in Italy and North Africa and Spain and France. They couldn't care less what the Reish Galosa was saying. But until the demise of the era of the Gedolim, until the year 950, the Reish Galosa was a very, very important political lay leadership figure that existed again for 1,000 years at least, from the time of the Gemara. We find the Gemara talking about the Reish Galosa. We find times in which there's tensions between the Rosh Yeshiva and the rabbinic authority and the Reish Galosa, the secular authority. We find times when they get on with each other. But basically, Reb Shimon ben Eli, Reb Shmuel ben Eli, claims that he has authority over the Reish Galosa also, and the Rambam again disagrees with that. Just as a fascinating insight, Reb Shmuel ben Eli at the Rosh Yeshiva claims he is a descendant of Shmuel Hanavi. The Exilarch, the Reish Galosa, are descendants of David HaMelech. That's a fact. Whether Reb Shmuel ben Eli's yichus is a fact or not, I don't know. It was more controversial, but he claims he's a descendant of Shmuel Hanavi. So he's even seeing like an analogy over here. You have the rabbinic leadership as per Shmuel Hanavi, in the role of appointing the secular leadership, the political leadership, the king, as per the descendants of David HaMelech. And therefore, in the same way, Shmuel Hanavi is granted by Hashem the right to appoint the Melech, similarly, I, Shmuel ben Eli, have the authority to appoint the Reish Galosa and have ultimate say over political and secular matters, financial matters, material matters, economic matters also. And the Rambam disagrees with this. He says, Rishul ben Eli, Rosh Yeshiva you are, but replacement of the Sanhedrin and Novi you are not. So this is the context of the Rambam's view. Sanhedrin have that authority. Even in later times, were we able to restore consensus and unified rabbinic authority, we would also have such authority in later times. However, we don't have such consensus anymore, and therefore we don't have the equivalent of the Sanhedrin. The Gedolim don't have sort of senior halachic authority over anyone else. Henceforth, it is now survival of the fittest. We all have to convince each other by the rationale and logic of our arguments, by our Torah knowledge, by our ability to share Pesach, and it's ultimately a democratic system, as has indeed been the case ever since. The Rambam won the battle, but lost the war, meaning that the consensus indeed was that there is no supreme authority anymore. Ever since then, communities have followed, in the words of the Rivash, whoever they have accepted as their local communal leader, and if they cease to want to accept their local community leader, they will vote with their feet and they will move to a different kehillah. But whilst they're local, they have to accept the authority of the Mora Da'achra. But beyond that, there's no supreme rabbinic authority, and in that sense, the Rambam won his argument. What creates a senior posek? Really, just a collection of Mora Da'achras. So Moshe Feinstein became accepted as a senior posek because he managed to convince, through the brilliance of his work and his halachic argumentation and the range of his knowledge, a vast number of Mora Da'achras, of local communal rabbanim, who are not up to his level of scholarship and knowledge, but are able at least to work through the arguments and become convinced or not. And that's what lends authority to a Rabbi Vadia Yosef, that's what lends authority to a Moshe Feinstein, and none of them have complete authority. No Pesach of Ramosha or Pesach of Rabbi Vadia is universally held. Even the followers of Ramosha and Rabbi Vadia won't accept everything they say. They will win 70% of the arguments, 80% of the arguments, but they won't convince everyone all the time. And in that sense, the Rambam won his claim. The Rambam, however, lost the second part of his claim, which was he was convinced that Mishnah Torah would seal forevermore the argumentation about how to learn Gemara and philosophy. He was convinced it was so good that everyone would find it completely convincing, and there would be no more debate and discussion in the Jewish world about how to paskin and about how to learn Mishnah and Gemara. He even writes in his introduction that learning Mishnah and Gemara will become a less necessary task because everything has been listed in Mishnah Torah. And of course, we know that part of his vision was never fulfilled. He was obviously an exceptionally important Rishon and Posek, but all he did was add another voice to the conversation, but there continued to be arguments around so much in Torah. So this is a summary of the issue of contemporary authority. We've seen the view of the Chinuch that absolutely applies in every generation. We've seen the view of the Ramban that doesn't seem to say that, and the Rambam who adopts a middle position that in theory such rabbinic Sanhedrin-like authority could be granted when there's a uniform central body of Talmidei Chachamim, of Talmudic scholars who engage in conversation that existed until the end of the Gemara. Now, until the end of the era of the Gemara, there's something like Sanhedrin authority. That's why we refer to them as Chazal. That's why we take as the last word their Durabanams, their Gezeras. Ever since then, it's been interpretation. If your interpretation is convincing, great. If it's not, not. And there hasn't been the same ability to create new legislation, certainly, ever since the close of the era of Chazal. I don't want to look at the chat group because I've got a couple of questions that have come through. Okay, Pat says irony that nowadays we have unparalleled means of communication. The rabbis speak across each other rather than to each other. Thank you. Apologies on being too negative. Only marginally so. I would like to think that there is some cross-rabbinic conversation, but you are correct. We are still grappling with how to talk to each other. And maybe since you've raised it, I'll just mention a couple of thoughts around that. The first thing is we all good communication needs a shared vocabulary. And part of the issue in rabbinic communication is we don't always have a shared vocabulary. Meaning, say it's true that technically we can speak to each other, but there's developed over 1,000 years of separation since the close of the era of the Gedolim, a different vocabulary. And by that I mean lots of things. I mean that Sephardi and Ashkenazi Rabbanim think and talk and learn differently. There's numerous darkei halimud. Even within each of these worlds, there's numerous ways of thinking. A Litvak, a Litvish posek, doesn't quite use the same vocabulary and think in the same way as a Yekish posek, or as a Hungarian posek, as a Romanian posek. There are a range of differences in how logic is used, and the same in the Sephardi world between the Nigerian poskim and the Moroccan poskim and the Middle East and the Babylonian, Iraqi, and Iranian poskim. There's simply different ways of thinking about Torah and how to learn it. And this has been problem number one. Some of the controversies and debates, for example, around Rabbi Yosef and some of the other poskim, was simply that there were different ways of thinking and learning, and numerous issues. Perhaps in a follow-up series, I can talk about psak and how psak works on a practical level. But how much weighting does one give to reason? How much weighting does one give to tradition, to minhag? How much weighting does one give to majority, to lining up a range of opinions and seeing what the majority is? How much weighting does one give to intuition? How much weighting does one give to external secular ethics? Philosophical factors. These are all debates that rage on until this day in the Jewish world, sometimes an Ashkenazi Sephardi divide, sometimes a Hashkafic divide between the difference across the spectrum from Haredi to modern Orthodox. So there's a problem in shared vocabulary, which makes communication very difficult in this area. And I think it is fair to say that we still don't have a uniformity or unanimity or an engaged conversation which would allow such acceptance of the people to arise. Interestingly, there have been at least 2 attempts in modern times to create such a forum, and both have been opposed by the majority of the rabbinic world due to a fear that such uniformity would create a dictatorship of democracy. Meaning to say, a democracy, as we heard Daniel Greenberg actually speaking about a while back, a democracy can also become a dictatorship in which the 51% impose their view on the 49%. And there has been a consensus that actually the Jewish world is better off by not having such central authority. And that the disparate authority, for all the divisions that it makes, and for the fact that therefore we don't behave with achdus, with uniformity, is better than uniformity and the risk of A, imposition of a majority view on a minority, and B, a lack of sensitivity to different geographies, different locations, different histories, and different ways of looking at the world. So were there to be a uniform body, the hashkafically majority body of rabbinic opinion would need to be accepted and would impose its view on the minority. And I don't want to go too much, I've avoided in this whole discussion of Das Torah into getting into current Jewish politics. I think all of us are aware that there are a range of different hashkafas, and numerically speaking in the Orthodox world, hashkafas that we may not personally agree with may be in the majority. So this, like it or not, that may be a statistical and demographic fact. And therefore, there's fear around this area. This is the first point. Secondly, geographical differences. There may be room for different kiddos to have different minhagim and different ways of behaving. So is it good necessarily for us to have uniformity in this way or not? Who says it's an ideal to have a uniform body? Thirdly, we have a range of different ways of thinking. And again, maybe there's space for a different range of thinking. And therefore, perhaps such uniformity should be left to the era of Mashiach, when hopefully we will have an achdus where we can genuinely get on rather than disagree. Now, fascinatingly, the initial attempts to create a neo-Sanhedrin of sorts were led by the religious Zionist and modern Orthodox world, not by the Haredi world. And it was the Haredi world that resisted what they feared would be an imposition of, at the time, perhaps a majority view or a more powerful view on a minority. Demographically, things, of course, swung since then. But in 1949, Rabbi Yehuda Leib Maimon, who was very early Mizrahi, mid-stage Mizrahi leader, after the state had, of course, been founded in 48, he was, I think, Israel's first minister of religious affairs in the Misrat HaTatzot, and he wanted to persuade the rabbinic body that we should renew a Sanhedrin in our time. The great synagogue in Yerushalayim was set up originally actually as a potential seat for this Sanhedrin, and as a result, it's also attracted controversy and criticism. And I don't know if you're aware, but to this day, the great synagogue in Yerushalayim. What's it called? Just gone blank. I can't hear you, David.
Heichal Shlomo.
Heichal Shlomo, thank you. Sorry, just gone blank. Heichal Shlomo, thank you. So the great synagogue in Yerushalayim became associated with this project, and it was opposed by many rabbinic authorities, including, by the way, Israel's great Ashkenazi chief rabbi, Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi Herzog, and eventually it died away. In 2004, some of you may have read, a group met in Tiberia to make a new Sanhedrin, and again basing itself on this Rambam's Pesach of Smicha, unanimously agreed by everyone, the story of Rabbi Yaakov Beirav, and many others. And again, it was Steinsaltz was involved, I think, somewhat in this initiative. And again, they actually granted smicha to Rabbi Vadi Yosef, to Ramosha Halberstam of the Eita Charedis, to Rabbi Yashiv, and various others. And none of them particularly accepted the smicha that was granted to them. And again, it didn't, the initiative really died away. So this is a sort of a history of why perhaps we were better off by not having such a uniform body. I'll stop there for today, but next week we will move on to the next stage of the discussion, which is what is the range of Das Torah? We've discussed till now the source of authority, to what degree historically it stretches across the generations, but we have left over what is the extent of it. Is it only in halachic matters, or does it indeed apply to politics and medical and other things? And that's where we will start off next week. And I hope to share with you an absolutely fascinating range of sources around this, this issue. I'll stop there for today, other than to say that someone texted me about, is it better to wait for Mashiach before creating a Torah state in Eretz Israel? That's a separate subject, so I'm not going to go into that issue. I've actually once addressed this before when I think I spoke about should Israel become a theocracy. Imagine we woke up one day and there were 61 from Chavri Knesset. Should Israel convert itself into theocracy? I'm thinking of revisiting this issue. I am waiting for suggestions for my upcoming Shabbos HaKotel, Joshua. So if you have any suggestions, please let me know. But this is one of the things that I'm interested in exploring again. But I'll stop here for today, and thank you all so much. Avram, are you waiting to ask something? Did you?
No.
Okay, I'm not sure if you unmuted yourself for that reason. So thank you all so much for joining, and be well.
Thank you.
Thank you.